tonight's program, he aims to shed a light on the recent experimental evidence on the concept of extended mind and challenge some of our long-standing beliefs. He will use the experimental results to show that our current belief that the mind is a product of the brain is too limited view. I'm sure you'll find his presentation, just like his books, thoroughly thought-provoking. His second presentation tonight will be given by Dr. Azmayesh, who is a renowned spiritual master, a researcher, as well as an expert in comparative religions and spiritual paths. His presentation will approach consciousness in spiritual terms, both as the ultimate reality behind creation of the world we live in, as well as from the human and non-human viewpoints. After the presentation, there will be a 20-minute tea break. Refreshment will be served outside, just downstairs. Following the break, there will be an open discussion forum, where the speakers will be open to taking questions from the audience on the topics raised in their presentations. I have in the past personally found this part of the presentation of great interest, as the audience opinions and questions have always generated fascinating discussions. I hope that you will find tonight's program both interesting and thought-provoking. Before I hand over tonight's proceedings, may I ask you to please switch off all your mobiles and refrain from taking pictures during the presentation. Thank you. So I'll now hand over tonight's program to Dr. Sheldrake.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about the extended mind, by which I mean the mind beyond the brain. And what I'm going to suggest to you this evening is that our minds stretch out far beyond our brains. They stretch out through fields, a kind of field that I call morphic fields. And the mind stretches out in space. It also stretches out in time, but I'm only going to be talking about the spatial extension of the mind this evening. We're familiar with the concept of fields which stretch out beyond material objects. The field of a magnet is inside the magnet, but it stretches out around the magnet. The field is a region of influence, as Faraday put it when he first described fields. So the field stretches out around the magnet. It's an invisible region of influence which has effects on iron filings or on other magnets. The Earth's gravitational field is a region of influence around the Earth. It's inside the Earth, but it stretches out invisibly, far beyond it, keeping the Moon in its orbit. The field of your mobile telephone, currently switched off, is inside the phone when it's switched on and stretches out beyond it invisibly. If it didn't, it wouldn't work. So what I'm suggesting is that our minds are rather like that. They depend on fields that are inside the brain but stretch out beyond the brain. Now this is a different point of view from the ones that we're so familiar with. In the West, the debate between materialism and dualism has been going on for centuries. And with the two familiar positions that we know are the materialist position, the mind is nothing but the brain, mental activity is brain activity, it's all inside the head. And that's the view which is currently orthodox in academic institutions and is the basis of mechanistic science, psychology and medicine. It's a materialist theory. And it grew up in reaction against a dualist theory, particularly the theory of Descartes in the 17th century, which says the body is a machine, it's material or mechanical. The mind is non-material, non-physical, not in space and time, but is utterly different in every way from the material reality of the body. And mysteriously, however, they somehow interact. Descartes thought this happened in the pineal gland, and modern dualist theories are very similar, except it shifted a couple of inches into the cerebral cortex. But the problem is dualists have never been able to explain what the mind is, or how it works, or how it interacts. And materialists point that out with glee, and the strongest part of materialism is their attack on dualism. On the other hand, the strongest aspect of dualism is its attack on materialism, because it's perfectly incredible to most people that they're nothing but the activity of their brain, that they have no free will, their consciousness doesn't actually do anything. It's just a kind of like a shadow of the physical activity of the brain. And what I'm suggesting is a third way. It's neither of those extremes. One has the mind totally inside the brain, the other has it completely outside space and time altogether. What I'm suggesting is that it extends through fields beyond the brain, but it's still localized. It's not totally beyond space and time. Now, the easiest way to see what I'm trying to say and to understand the problem is to think about vision. What happens when you look at something? Now, you all know the standard scientific account. For example, when you see me standing here now, light's reflected from me, travels through the electromagnetic field, enters your eyes, inverted images on your retinas, changes in the cone cells, impulses up the optic nerve, and then changes in various regions of the brain. And through brain scanning, we know in more detail than ever before where these changes are, what kinds of changes happen in the brain. Well, that's it. That's as far as it goes. It describes the changes in the brain, but it doesn't explain vision, this theory. There are two problems in explaining vision. First, you're conscious of what you see, and there's no explanation for consciousness in a materialist theory of the mind. Consciousness doesn't do anything. It might just as well not be there. So the very existence of consciousness is a big problem for science, and among philosophers of mind it's called the hard problem, because no one knows how to explain it in terms of physics and chemistry. But there's a second problem, and it's less obvious. That is that your image of me and of everything in this room is supposed to be inside your head. All your conscious experience is supposed to be generated inside your brain, and therefore inside your head. But that's not what you experience. When you see me standing here now, you don't experience your image of me as being inside your head, and yet that's where it should be. Some philosophers of mind have pointed out that, in fact, everything you're seeing, if it's inside your head, means that your skull must be outside everything you see. So if you look at the sky at night, your skull must be beyond the sky. A seminal paper was published a few years ago in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, one of the key journals in this field, by Stephen Lehar. It was entitled, "Is Your Skull Beyond the Sky?" To which Lehar gave the answer, yes. Everything you see is inside your head, according to the standard view which he is defending. And therefore your skull is beyond the sky, it's beyond this room, it's beyond everything you're experiencing. Of course, the skull you think is there isn't the real skull, that's just a phenomenal skull produced inside this display of phenomena, which are all inside your head. Now this sounds very strange and peculiar, and yet it's an implication of the standard orthodox theory. By contrast, I'm proposing a theory that's so simple it's hard to understand, and that is that your image of me is located right here, exactly where it seems to be, outside your head, outside your brain. It's in your mind. What you see in the world is interpreted by your mind, produced by your mind, but I'm suggesting it's not inside your head. Your image is right here. Now, that's a shocking theory because it supposes that vision involves a two-way process. Light moves into the eyes, changes happen in the brain, and images are projected out to where they seem to be. So your mind is projecting out the world around you into space, and it's doing it through fields of the mind, mental fields or perceptual fields. These fields are extended to where they seem to be. In a sense, through these fields, your mind reaches out to touch what you're looking at. If you look at a distant star, your mind is reaching out over literally astronomical distances to touch that star. Well, this is not a new theory, although it may be unfamiliar to many modern people. It's the theory of vision that was held by Plato. It was the theory that the ancient Greeks, in general, held. Euclid, the great geometer, had this theory of vision. He explained how you see images behind mirrors, virtual images, in terms of this, that they're projected out by the eye. the light bounces off the mirror and comes to the eye, but the virtual image is projected out by the eye. It goes straight through the mirror. That's why it's behind the mirror and why it's separate from the actual object. His theory had, and Plato's theory had a big influence in the Arab world, and there were major advances in optics, which then influenced subsequent thought in Europe. And it was in 1604 that Johannes Kepler, one of the founders of modern science, came up with the theory of the retinal image, the lens producing the inverted images on the retina. And since then, in Western science, right from the beginning of Western science, it's been assumed that the vision is produced somehow inside the brain. Kepler couldn't explain it, and no one's explained it since. But the original theory, until Kepler's theory, that most people in the West and the Arab world held was that vision involves an outward projection of images. That's what traditional people believe all over the world. It's what Hindu and Buddhist philosophers believe. And it's what children under the age of 10 or 11 believe, even in our own society. The developmental psychologist, Jean Piaget, showed that until the age of 10 or 11, children believed that vision involves a two-way process. That's why in Superman comics there are rays coming out of Superman's eyes. And this is taken for granted by children until they reach the age of about 11, when, in Piaget's words, they learn the correct view, which is that thoughts and images are invisible things inside heads. Now, this is in fact a very eccentric theory put forward by philosophers in the 17th century in the West, and it's now become so generally accepted in our society that when people are talking about things in their mind, they often say it's in my brain or it's in my head. It's just the common sense view, but it goes completely against our most immediate experience. Now, I think children may be more right than grown-ups about this, and what I've been trying to do in relation to this is to test these theories. If everything's inside your head, looking at something should have no effect on what you look at. If your mind reaches out through fields or through any other means to touch what you're looking at, you may be able to affect things just by looking at them. Is that possible? Well, phrase it slightly differently. If you look at another person from behind and they don't know you're there, could they feel your gaze? Could they feel you looking at them? Now, as soon as you put it that way, you see this is a common experience. The vast majority of people have actually had this experience. So you feel you're being looked at, you just turn around, there's someone staring at you. Or you stare at someone from behind and they turn around and look straight at you. Surveys show that the great majority of children and adults have had this experience. There is a slight sex difference. More women than men have experienced being looked at, and more men than women have experienced looking at others and making them turn around. But the majority of both sexes are very familiar with this, and I imagine most people in this room know what I'm talking about from personal experience. Now, some people are more sensitive than others, and some people are better at looking and have a more effective gaze than others. So here's something that almost everyone knows about, but which has been filtered out of science. There's been virtually no investigations of this phenomenon until about 15 years ago. Not mentioned in psychology textbooks except as a popular superstition. Even parapsychologists had ignored this very, very common phenomenon. That's because people's thinking is shaped by habits of thought, paradigms. Things that don't fit in are just dismissed. Skeptics dismiss it by saying, oh, you turn around all the time, and occasionally you see someone looking at you, and you remember it and think there's some mysterious phenomenon going on, but you forget the millions of times there's nobody there. They have no evidence to back up this suggestion, they just say it. And they've got away with it scot-free for more than a century. The thing to do really is to test this experimentally, and I've developed a very simple experimental test, so simple a child can do it. And in fact, thousands of children already have done it. It's being done extensively in primary schools in Britain, Germany and America. It's also being done in universities and colleges and in laboratories. And the simple test involves people working in pairs. The subject of the test wears a blindfold. I use these airline blindfolds. The other person sits behind. And in a random series of trials, they either look at the back of the person's neck or they look away and think of something else. The beginning of the trial is indicated by a click or a beep. So if I were the subject, I'd be wearing the blindfold, I'd hear a click or a beep, and then I'd guess looking or not looking, and I'd be right or wrong. If there were no sense of being stared at, I'd be right about 50% of the time. And these experiments give consistent, repeatable results. They show repeatedly that people are right, on average, about 55% of the time. It's not a big effect, but over hundreds of thousands of trials, it's very, very significant statistically. And it's very repeatable. It's been repeated in many parts of the world by independent investigators. Now, of course, some people are more sensitive than others. This is just including everybody. Young children are the most sensitive. In an experiment of this kind that's been running in the Amsterdam Science Museum for the last 20 years, it's one of the biggest experiments ever conducted. It's shown a massively significant positive result. And it's also shown that the most sensitive subjects are children under the age of 9. In my own experiments, young children are the most sensitive. And I think that's because young children grow up in houses and in homes where the look of everyone who looks at them is significant. As we get older, we spend more time in public places where hundreds of people pass us every day in the streets of London and elsewhere. We desensitize ourselves. Now, people become more sensitive when they feel under threat in some way. And many people in dark streets at night become very sensitive and can often pick up when strangers are looking at them in a way that could be threatening. Now, most of us are mere amateurs, but there are people whose job it is to watch others. They do it for a living. I'm referring to surveillance officers, private detectives, policemen, and others who watch people for a living. And I've interviewed security and police officers about this. Most of them are completely convinced that this is real. They notice it the whole time. If you go on a private detective training course, for example, one of the first things you learn when you're being trained how to follow other people is don't stare at their back. Because if you do, they're likely to feel you're there, turn around, catch your eye, your cover's blown. You have to look at them a little bit, of course, otherwise you lose them. But it's better to look at their feet. In the SAS, the British SAS, when people are being trained how to creep up behind people to stab them in the back, they're told don't stare at their back, because otherwise they'll turn around and shoot you first. So among practical people, these things are completely accepted. In the martial arts, they're accepted and people are trained how to become more sensitive to being looked at from behind. Now, so there's experimental evidence, there's evidence from all these practical people. And there's also a surprising phenomenon that it even works through closed circuit television. Many surveillance officers have found that people can tell when they're being watched through CCTV. For example, the store detective at Harrods told me that he and his colleagues were once watching some women shoplifting shoes in the shoe department. They had hidden cameras. They were watching them from the security booth on their screens. And he said he got his colleague, they were watching them intensely, planning to go and arrest them. When women felt something was happening, they looked around to look for a camera. They couldn't see it because it was hidden. But what happened is they put the shoes back and they just walked out of the shop. I gave a talk on this in Washington, D.C., and one of the people in the audience worked for the FBI. And he told me that in his training, their trainer had said, if you see someone doing something they shouldn't be doing, just stare at them hard on the screen and they'll probably stop. And I said, does that work? He said, every day. He said, it's really commonplace. He said, I do it all the time. People are smoking where they shouldn't be smoking or doing something they're not meant to do. So these things are well known, and experiments also show that if you put electrodes on people's fingers to measure physiological arousal, like in a lie detector, and you have a closed-circuit television camera pointing at them, someone in another room looks at them on the screen or doesn't look at them in a random sequence, their skin resistance changes significantly when they're being watched by someone in another room through closed-circuit television. This is a physiological response. They may not be conscious of it, but their body is picking this up. These experiments have now been done and repeated in Britain, America, and in other countries. The evidence seems quite clear. I think this experiment could be taken much further. It hasn't been so far, but if people can tell when one person's looking at them over closed-circuit television, what if millions of people are looking at them on real television? This would make a great experiment for live television. It would be extremely interesting, and it would tell us something about our media. People who are on television usually assume that they're sending out images, but nothing comes back. However, if they're affected by being seen by people, by being, as we put it, in the public eye, then what comes back to them could affect them, not necessarily for the good. That's, I think, one of the things that our modern celebrity culture does. And as a cynical journalist friend of mine once said, we like celebrity stories because you get two stories for the price of one. You build them up, then you pull them down. And I think that celebrities exposed to a great deal of public attention may indeed be affected by it. Anyway, here we have a phenomenon that's extremely well known. There's a great deal of folklore concerning the effect of looks. Most people have experienced it. Science has ignored it until recently because it doesn't fit in. It's not that scientists have carefully considered the evidence and decided it's not worth investigating. They just brushed it aside because it doesn't fit with the idea of the mind's inside the brain. It ought not to happen. Now, animals are sensitive to this too. I've interviewed hunters, people who hunt deer, and wildlife photographers. I interviewed the top wildlife photographers who won the wildlife photography competition at the Natural History Museum a few years ago. And most of them are convinced that animals can tell when they're being watched, even if the photographer's hidden in a hide, looking through a telephoto lens a long way from the animal. They told me, if you don't take the picture quickly, they'll just fly off or run away because they can feel you're there. Deer hunters say that if you stalk a deer and you've got it in your telescopic rifle sights, if you don't shoot quickly, the deer will feel you're there and it will run away. So these things are well known to people who work with animals. And many people have noticed it at home with their pets. I think that this is something very basic. Animals have it, we have it. We don't have it because we're special, we have it because we're animals. Many animals seem to have this sensitivity. And I think it probably originates in relations between predators and prey. If prey animals can tell when they're being looked at by a predator, they'd have more chance of escaping than animals that can't tell. And I think natural selection and evolution would have favoured this ability over many years. We know very little about the natural history of this phenomenon in the wild, because the taboo nature of the subject means that naturalists haven't studied it, and animal behaviour researchers haven't studied it. There's no reason why they shouldn't. And I think when they do, we'll probably discover a whole fascinating world of interactions between predator and prey, and animals in general, which we haven't yet explored. So it's not hard to investigate it, it's not expensive to investigate it, and the data from experiments so far suggest this is a real ability, and it shows our minds reach out to touch what we're looking at. I think that our minds stretch out through attention to the objects of our attention. The very Latin word, ad tendere, the root of our English word attention, means to stretch towards. Ad means towards, tendere means to stretch, as in tension, tent, and so on. So I think our minds stretch out through attention every time we attend to something with our eyes and with our ears. No one's yet investigated the effect of auditory attention. I'm just designing some experiments right now. I've done a few preliminary tests, and I think that the same principles apply to hearing, as to vision. Now, I think our minds are extended beyond our brains in other ways as well. And one of them concerns social bonds. All social animals, by definition, live in groups and interact with other members of the society. All social groups have to have ways of coordinating the interaction of the individual members. This is shown very dramatically by flocks of starlings. Here you see a flock of starlings over Brighton West Pier. And here are some flocks of starlings photographed as they turn. These flocks can be several thousand birds big, and they turn very rapidly, much more rapidly than they could if the birds were just looking at their neighbours. It's much too fast for that. The best computer models of this phenomenon treat it as a field phenomenon, where the whole group is a field, like a magnetic field. It's not a magnetic field, it's another kind of field. But imagine moving a magnet near iron filings. They all line up in different ways. And the birds are, on these models, being affected by the field of the whole group. I think this field is a kind of field that I call a morphic field. This is a theory I've developed. I'm not talking about that particular theory this evening, but it's summarized in my books, A New Science of Life and The Presence of the Past, both of which have just been issued in new editions, fully updated. Now the same applies to schools of fish. Here you see a large school of fish. And the fish, like the birds, can move very rapidly. If a predator approaches them, they undergo what's called a flash expansion. The whole school moves apart very rapidly, creating a hole around the predator. They accelerate extremely fast, and they don't bump into each other. So that means they not only know where their neighbours are, but they know where they're going to go. And this, again, can't be explained just by looking at the neighbours and processing the information through the nervous system. Something else is happening. And I think these are field phenomena. All groups, all animal groups, I think, have them. Now, when you have animals like wolves, very often the group will split up. In a wolf pack, when they have cubs, the cubs are left in the den, usually with a babysitter, and the adult wolves go out hunting to bring food back for the young. What I think happens there is that the field of the group doesn't break when they go away, it stretches. So it's like an invisible elastic band that continues to connect the separated members of the group. There's already evidence from naturalists that wolves are telepathic with each other in the wild. They seem to know what other members of the group are doing many miles away, way beyond the range of smell and sound. And so I think that this field that stretches continues to connect separated members of social groups. And I think that's the basis of telepathy. Telepathy literally means distant feeling. Tele, distant, as in telephone. Pathy, feeling, as in sympathy and empathy. And I think members of animal groups remain connected at a distance telepathically. I think it's a normal, not paranormal, natural, not supernatural means of communication among animals. And because I think that this is a normal and natural thing, I've been thinking about it in natural terms. There's an analogy in physics for this. In quantum theory, if two particles have been part of the same system and they move apart, they remain connected at a distance through what's called quantum non-locality or quantum entanglement. A change in one instantly affects the other. Einstein was one of the first people to point this out. And when he did so, he thought it meant that quantum theory must be wrong, because he thought if quantum theory is right, it allows for what he called a spooky action at a distance. The experiments show that if quantum theory is right, Einstein was wrong. There really is this spooky action at a distance. And it doesn't fall off with distance either. That's important because telepathy doesn't seem to fall off with distance. Sometimes people say, well, that proves it doesn't exist because everything in physics falls off with distance. Well, it doesn't. The thing most closely analogous to telepathy, quantum entanglement, doesn't fall off with distance. So, because I think telepathy is a natural means of communication among animals, I've investigated it in animals. I started my investigations primarily with animals. And I started with the animals we know best, dogs, cats, and other animals, domestic animals that are kept as pets, parrots, horses, rabbits, guinea pigs, ferrets, budgerigars, and so on. And I asked people who keep animals if they'd ever noticed their animals seem to respond to their thoughts or intentions. When I launched appeals for this through BBC radio, television, newspapers, ranging from the Sunday Telegraph to the now defunct News of the World, I received an overwhelming response from all levels of society that many people have noticed their dogs or cats seem to pick up their intentions. I have more than 5,000 of these stories on the database, classified into more than 60 categories. And these give us a kind of natural history of what people have noticed in their pets. It doesn't prove that what people have noticed is necessarily true, or at least the way they interpret it, but it shows us that there are recurrent patterns of behaviour that are worth investigating further. For example, I have more than 200 stories from people about their cats knowing when they're planning to take the cat to the vet. The cats disappear. Most cats hate going to the vet, and when they feel that their owner's about to take them, they hide. Now, when this has happened several times, people get very annoyed by it, and they try to avoid giving the cat any clues. They don't let it see the carrying basket. They avoid mentioning the word vet in the cat's presence, but the cat still seems to know. And some people, out of despair, ring up the vet from work so the cat can't overhear the conversation, and make an appointment and swing by to pick up the cat after work, but it's still not there. Now, we heard so many of these stories, we did a survey to see how common it was. We rang up all 65 veterinary clinics in the North London Yellow Pages and asked them if they ever had a problem with people missing appointments with their cat. 64 out of 65 said, yes, it happens all the time. And the remaining ones said it happened so often they'd given up the appointment system for cats. The phenomenon that I've studied in most detail is dogs and cats that know when their owners are coming home. Many people have dogs or cats that go and wait at a door or window when a member of the family is on the way home. And this is actually very common. I've done random household surveys by telephone that show about 50% of dogs do it, about 30% of cats. It doesn't necessarily prove cats are less sensitive than dogs, just that some of them are less interested. So the stories I've got, I have over 1,000 of these stories about dogs and hundreds of cats doing this. And the stories make it clear it's not just a matter of routine. Most people first think, oh, well, maybe it's just routine, or maybe it's just hearing the familiar car engine. And when cats do it, or dogs do it at routine times, perhaps it is routine. When they respond just a minute or two before the person arrives, perhaps they're just hearing footsteps, or a lift coming up, or a familiar car approaching the house. But in many cases, they do it 10 minutes, even half an hour in advance. And so, and from many of these stories that people told me, people who have non-routine jobs, like lawyers, journalists, taxi drivers, plumbers, and so on, who come home at different times, the people at home know when they're coming in many households because the dog goes and starts waiting at the door or window. More than 50 women have told me that they know when their husband's coming home because of the dog going to the window. And so they start getting his meal ready so it's hot on the table when he arrives. I've only heard of one man who does that for his wife. She doesn't get a meal, she gets a cup of tea. But that's better than nothing. So this behaviour is very well known. And it seems to be a matter of intention. If people change their mind, the animal seems to respond to that too. When I first started this appeal, I wanted in my hometown in Nottinghamshire, I wanted to do the appeal in my hometown to start with, because I'm known there and I thought it was the best place to start. So I talked to the editor of our local newspaper, who I'd known for years, and I said, would you mind running a story on this so I can appeal for information about this behaviour. And he said, yes, I'd be happy to do it. He said, in fact, my dog knows when I'm coming home. And he said, it's quite a nuisance. And I said, why is it a nuisance? He said, because if I leave the office and then I think of going to visit someone or bump into someone or go for a drink at the pub, when I get home, my wife says to me, Roger, where have you been? You left the office 2 hours ago. Because the dog went and started waiting when he left the office, so she knew he'd actually not been coming straight home. There are many of these stories. Then I looked at the scientific literature. What research has been done on this phenomenon? The answer, nothing. Because it's a taboo subject. Telepathy is a taboo. Taking pets seriously is a taboo. So it's doubly taboo. And no one had looked at it. That's not because it doesn't happen, not because it's not interesting, but because it doesn't fit the narrow dogmatic mindset which says these things are impossible. And many scientists, of course, know they're possible, but they don't want to get into trouble with their colleagues, so they keep quiet or avoid working on these controversial areas. Anyway, it turns out to be very simple to do experiments, and I've now done lots of them. In our basic experiments, people go at least 5 miles from home. We film the place where the dog waits the whole time they're out, so we've got a complete record of every time the dog goes to the door or window and when it does so, because we have a time code on the film. And then they stay out until I ask them to come back at a randomly chosen time. They don't know in advance when they're coming home. It's not a routine time, it's a random time. I choose it, I ring them up on a mobile phone and ask them to go home at that time. And I ask them to go home by taxi, so there's no familiar car sounds. They then have to ring for a taxi, so there's usually a delay before they get in the vehicle. What we found in these experiments over and over again is the dog starts waiting when they form the intention to go home. It's even before they got into the taxi. And this happens with different times, with different distances, with different modes of transport. It works whether people travel by train, bus, taxi, car, whatever. Now this research has now been done extensively and repeated. Even one of Britain's skeptics, leading skeptics, repeated experiments with the dog I worked with most and got very similar results. In his experiments, the dog went through the window an average of 4% of the time when the owner wasn't coming home, and 78% of the time when she was. And it was a highly significant statistical effect. You can find my published papers on this research on my website. They're all there for free. www.sheldrake.org. And you can find a much more detailed description of my work with animals in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home and Other Unexplained Powers of Animals, in which I deal with many kinds of animal telepathy, also with a sense of direction, and animal premonitions, like premonitions of earthquakes and tsunamis. And that book's just come out in a new edition. Now, the same principles apply to people. And people, if you look at the natural history of human telepathy, it typically happens between people who know each other very well. It happens between mothers and children, husbands and wives, best friends, twins, siblings. It doesn't happen with random strangers. It happens between people who are closely bonded. And I think the same principles apply. If you're a member of a family or of a social group, you're bonded with each other. You're connected even at a distance. And there are many, many types of human telepathy, but most of them concern not downloading huge amounts of information, like sort of telephone numbers and things, but needs like fear, injury, even death, or the wish to talk to somebody, we want to call them. For example, many mothers have found that they are sensitive to their baby's needs. And I've done a whole study on nursing mothers, because I had many stories from mothers about their connection with the baby when they were breastfeeding. Though I have to give a little physiological background first for the benefit of the men in the room. There's a physiological response called the milk letdown reflex that's mediated by oxytocin, the so-called love hormone. When a breastfeeding mother, hears the baby cry, there's a reflex response of oxytocin is released by the brain, and the breasts get ready to feed the baby. They start squeezing out milk, the nipples leak, and many women experience a tingling sensation in the breasts. So the phenomenon is this, that when women they're still breastfeeding, but they go back to work or they start leaving the baby after a few months with a babysitter. Under those conditions, many women have found that for no apparent reason, they might be shopping in a supermarket, their milk lets down. They just feel their breast tingle, there's no baby crying. And almost every woman who experiences that just assumes that her baby needs her. And until recently, they just went home. Now they ring home on a mobile phone first to see if they're right or not. And they usually are. I did a study with 9 nursing mothers in North London over a 2-month period each, in which we showed that every time they had a milk let down, or almost every time, and it really did happen, coincided with the baby's distress. The odds against it being a chance effect were 1 billion to 1. Again, this is something that no one else has investigated, not because it's expensive, not because it's difficult, but because it's taboo. I can think of dozens of really interesting PhDs that people in colleges of nursing or midwifery could do on studying these telepathic links between mothers and babies. And it's one of the most basic of our biological bonds. And I think that it's particularly important in evolutionary terms. Until modern telephones and technology was invented, the only way that a mother could know when a child really needed her was by telepathy. It's instant and it works over any distance. But without that, the only way she could have known was by somebody running to tell her that if she was miles away, it could take a long time before she got the message. Mothers that knew when their babies needed them and responded to them would have babies more likely to survive than mothers that didn't know. And would therefore, the evolutionary reasons would favour this response, not just in humans, but in all mammals. All mammals, by definition, breastfeed. I've studied various other forms of telepathy, and again, these are summarised in a book I wrote on unexplained human past called The Sense of Being Stared At and Other Aspects of the Extended Mind, on telepathy, premonitions, and other kinds of intuition. But I'll end by talking about what's the most common kind of telepathy in the modern world, and that is telepathy that's evolved in connection with telephone calls. Telephones enable us to call people at a distance, and before you call them, you have to have an intention to call them. And what happens very, very commonly is that people think of someone for no apparent reason, then that person calls, and they say, "That's funny, I was just thinking about you." So this intention precedes the call, and I think that's what people are picking up. Now, I've done surveys on this phenomenon, and here you see the results. If we look at telephone telepathy, which is the bars on the left, which say tele, that's the incidence of telephone telepathy in surveys conducted in a range of countries. Over 95% of women have had this experience, and more than 70% of men. Women more than men, but still the majority of men. The other bar diagram shows the incidence of other kinds of telepathy. Again, women more than men, but telephone telepathy is much commoner than any other kind of telepathy. Now, people don't always think it must be telepathic, but many people have had that experience. How many people here have had that sort of experience with phone calls? Well, that's certainly the great majority. This has been going on ever since telephones were invented. Now, what does science have to tell us about it? Well, predictably, until recently, nothing. The response of most scientists to this was to dismiss it, with a standard skeptical argument that most of you have probably heard, maybe even spoken yourself. When I was a skeptic myself, I used to say this all the time. Anyone who's had a university education knows they're meant to say this, and at least in public. Which is, oh well, it must just be a coincidence. You think about people all the time, then one of them rings, and you think it might be, then you might falsely imagine it's telepathy or some mysterious connection, but you simply forget the millions of times you were wrong. Now, people have got away with that argument for over 100 years without a shred of evidence. It's not unreasonable as an argument, but in science you need more than a hypothesis, you need evidence, and there's been no, until recently, no experimental tests at all on this. I've devised a very simple experiment to find out what's really going on. And in this experiment, the basic experiment, we find people who say this happens to them. We ask them to sit at home in a room with a landline telephone, no caller ID display, with no computer on in the room, no mobile phone, no other means of communication. We film them to make sure they're not getting any other messages. And we ask them to give us the names and phone numbers of 4 people they know well, family members or close friends. We then pick one of the 4 at random by the throw of a dice and ring them up and ask them to call their friend, the subject. So they do. The phone rings, the person sitting there, the phone rings. Before they pick it up, they have to guess who it is on the phone out loud. They say, I think it's John. They pick it up, hello John. They're right or they're wrong. They'd be right one time in 4 or 25% if it was just guessing, if there were no telepathy. In fact, in these experiments, on the left you see the chance level, 25%. The actual hit rate is 45%. For those of you who are into statistics, there are hundreds of trials. It's a massively significant effect. P is 1 times 10 to the minus 12. This is a massively significant phenomenon. This has turned out to be quite a repeatable phenomenon. It's now being replicated at the universities of Amsterdam and Freiburg in Germany. I did a replication of this for a television program with the Nolan sisters, the 1980s girl band. You can see that on YouTube. If you go to my website, scroll down the right-hand column, there's a link to the Nolan sisters experiment. It's well worth looking at. We don't have time to see it now. It's only about 5 minutes, but if you're interested, take a look when you get home. I also did experiments to compare the effect of familiar and unfamiliar callers. In this graph, you see on the chart, you see on the left the hit rate with 2 unfamiliar callers, on the right with 2 familiar callers. They're all in the same experiment. With the unfamiliar callers, it's 26%. It's practically at the chance level. With familiar callers, it's 52%. It's twice the chance level. This is direct evidence for the fact that telepathy works between people who are bonded or know each other well, but not between strangers. It's different, you see, from the sense of being stared at. That does work with strangers, even with members of other species. But telepathy is different. It's a connection between, an emotional connection, a shared feeling between people who know each other well. And this summarizes the results of these experiments. The third point down, no effect of distance. With telephones you can actually test this. We recruited young Australians and New Zealanders, mostly from the Earl's Court area of London. We did tests where 2 of their callers were from new acquaintances in England, and 2 were their nearest and dearest down under. They scored above chance overall, but they scored higher with the nearest and dearest down under than with the new acquaintances in England, showing that what matters is emotional closeness, not physical closeness. I now have an automated telephone telepathy test which works off my website, and I invite you all to have a go. It's easy to do, it's fun, it's free, and it helps this line of scientific investigation. What you do is you log on, you put in your name and your mobile phone number, you put in the names and mobile phone numbers of 2 friends or family members. The computer then picks one of these 2 people at random, sends them a text message asking them to telephone you at a landline, which is actually the computer. They ring the computer number. The computer puts them on hold, and then it rings you. Your telephone ID, the caller ID, says telephone telepathy test. And when you answer it, it says, this is your telephone telepathy test. one of your two callers is on the line right now waiting to speak to you. Please guess who it is by pressing 1 for Andrew or 2 for Bill. So you guess who it is by pressing the button, and then the line immediately opens up, so you find out if you're right or wrong. And you can talk to the person for up to a minute when it cuts off, because I'm paying for the call. And after a random time delay, it does it again until you've done 6 trials. And then everyone involved gets a text message saying thanks for taking part. The subject scored 4 out of 6, or whatever their score was. And then you can do it again. So anyway, do try it. And I'm at present looking for a small number of research helpers to help with this research. What you have to do is recruit 6 other people to do it. You have to do it yourself first, so you understand the test. And you get paid, not a lot, £100, but it's easy money for something that's relatively easy to do, just motivating 6 of your friends or family members. If you're interested in doing that, email me through my website and I'll send you the details. This research, you see, is simple, easy, it can happen in the real world, you don't need special labs, it works with the grain of natural and ordinary experience. And I've given seminars on this at Google, Microsoft and Nokia. There are now people in the new media world who are very interested in this, and there are several plans afoot to develop apps based on these tests for smartphones and iPhones. And I think it should soon be possible to have these kinds of tests, even training systems for improving your telepathy working on mobile phones. I think they'd be very popular. I think they'd spread all over the world. And it would enable people to practice and improve their abilities. When that happens, one could even have competitions, national telepathy contests, and even the telepathy Olympics eventually. And when it gets to that level, you see, the question, does telepathy exist, would stop being a question. Most people already believe it does because they've experienced it. Even most scientists believe it does because they've experienced it. But when they go into their laboratories, they pretend it doesn't because they're afraid that their colleagues will think that they're stupid or uneducated or gullible or something like that, because it's a taboo. When I was, one of my first seminars on my work on telepathy in dogs was in the veterinary school of a major British university, I won't mention which one, and I talked about my experiments. And there were about 6 scientists in this unit, and there were some students there. It was a small group. Afterwards, when we were having tea, the scientists, I saw them sort of look to see if any of their colleagues were nearby. And if they thought they weren't, they said to me, I'm sure this really happens. I've got a dog that knows when I'm coming home from the lab. I think it's really interesting, but I can't talk about it here at work because my colleagues are all so straight. And when all 6 of them said the same thing, including the professor, I said to them, why don't you guys come out? So you have so much more fun. And I think what will really change science is not piling up more and more evidence. We've already got a lot of evidence these things happen. It's in respectable journals, it's been replicated. But scientists feeling free to talk to their colleagues in the laboratory about these things. And there'll be some skeptics who'll say it's rubbish, it doesn't exist. But then call their bluff, say, okay, how do you know it doesn't exist? Have you looked at the evidence? Most of them haven't. And finally, the same thing happens with emails as telephone calls and with SMS messages. I've done very similar experiments with very similar results. Finally, just a point on skeptics. I've had encounters with most of Britain's leading skeptics because they don't like this kind of research. And what I've found is, here is what they've said about it. What I've found in every single case of these people here, Professor Atkins, Professor Richard Dawkins, and Professor Walpert, when they said telepathy doesn't exist, there's no evidence for it, it turned out that they had never read any of the evidence at all. It turned out they didn't even feel they needed to read it because they were so sure they were right, that all the evidence must be wrong, because it's impossible for this to happen, because the mind is inside the head, and therefore it can't possibly affect people at a distance. This is pure and simple dogma. It's a kind of blind belief. Atheists like Dawkins often accuse religious people of blind belief, but in my experience, scientists are much worse than most religious people, much more dogmatic when it comes to areas like this that threaten the materialist worldview. But we don't need to concern ourselves too much with ill-informed skeptics. I think the important point is that these things happen. Most people have experienced them happening. The scientific research suggests they really do happen. And as the taboos break down, more research will become possible. There's a tremendous amount could be done to explore these things further. I disagree with some of my scientific colleagues who believe that scientists should close ranks and deny these phenomena to preserve science and reason against the onslaught of superstition, which is how they feel. They feel very defensive. They feel science is being attacked by superstition. Instead, I say we should look at the phenomena, look at them, investigate them scientifically with an open mind, and expand the frontiers of science. Include these phenomena within an expanded view of human nature and animal nature, and an enhanced scientific understanding of the nature of the mind. That, I think, is happening now. Consciousness studies, the study of the nature of the mind, is one of the most exciting areas of science at the moment. Surprisingly, we know less about our own minds than we do about distant galaxies, or the structure of atoms, or the sequences of DNA. It's the thing we know least about. But I think we're beginning at last to find out more scientifically about these subjects. Thank you.
Thank you.
The human brain gathers the information from the outer world through the five senses. The eyes are thus an extension of the brain, and the brain observes the external world. It visualizes the images it receives through the eyes. The eyes are able to perceive every visible thing in its field of vision than itself. The brain is also able to sense everything with its field of perception other than itself. Therefore, the outer world is the world outside of the brain. When the eyes are shut, the connection of the brain to the outer world is interrupted. And when this happens, the other centers of the brain become more active, like the centers responsible for imagination, the common sense, memory, etc. While the eyes are open, the brain is able to collect the information from the universe around it, and also acts as the center of the universe it observes, as it places itself at the center of its field of perception. The brain then collects the information and analyzes it. The brain, in a way, acts as a particular being which can define and evaluate what is to its advantage and disadvantage with regards to itself. Within this frame of reference, the brain is not only the center of the self, but it is also the place and the seat of the self. Thus, in some sense, we can say that the brain acts like a central cyber system or a computer that is connected to sensors like cameras, microphones, etc., exactly like a robot. The only difference is that the brain is using an individual natural intelligence while the robot uses an artificial intelligence mechanism to know and to understand the things around it. The activities of the natural brain and artificial robot both require energy to function. Any serious interruption of the flow of energy to the brain or to the cyber system will result in their termination. In other words, they both will die. The dead brain and the dead robot will stop compiling the new information about the outer world. The dead brain and the dead robot will stop memorizing and recording the new events. However, the new experiences have shown that after interruption of the brain activities, after death, a local memory keeps on going and recording and is able to perceive new events and to memorize them. This faculty starts its activities while the brain has ceased to function. In general, the mind is a no-located reality, and its capacities are covered by the activities of the brain during its normal operation. However, when the brain stops functioning, the extended mind comes into action. The study and the research on the out-of-body experiences or near-death experience or la mort imminente offers to us an irrefutable and solid evidence for these types of experience. Out-of-body experience is the experience of a self that is free from the frame of the brain. Somehow, it appears that the function of the cortex during normal operation causes a problem for the action of the extended mind and no located consciousness. Therefore, the brain and especially the new cortex seem to be an obstacle for the mind in the road toward knowing itself. Now, what about other living creatures that are free from this obstacle? By this, I mean other living beings that don't possess complex brain. Insects are not intelligent beings. They are not comparable to the artificial robots. But they are the creative animals inspired by the large field of knowledge. The insects, such as the ants, bees, spiders, are knowledgeable. They are creative living beings. They are inventors and innovators. They are able, without possessing any developed brain or new cortex, to have a three-dimensional perception of their environment. They are guided by an invisible, superior mind. I have come to appreciate the creative spiders, which integrate in their hunting strategy the latest innovation and invention of the civilized men of today. They have been able to integrate in their method of making the basket of webs and traps the man-made technology, such as the glass window and electricity. It seems that they owe a debt of thanks to Thomas Edison for his discoveries and invention of the electrical light bulb, and the artificial sources of light inside of the closed space of rooms and houses. Because before the invention of the light bulb, spiders were forced to make their webs at the entry-exit points of the caves. But today, the human technology has offered them a huge facility for improving their hunting strategy. By a kind of an innate knowledge, the spiders know that the flies are attracted towards light, and they fly always in direction of the light. Therefore, the spiders hunt the different types of animals, including insects, flies, bats, little birds, by making their traps in the border of the dark corners that are exposed to light, like the edge of the entry-exit of the caves. The spiders are able to evaluate the animals that they would like to capture and make appropriate alterations to their basket of webs they create, such as developing web network that is composed of the multiple layers in order to optimize their hunting strategy. Spiders are expert architects and are able to make diverse styles of nets in circular three-dimensional form that are able to meet the necessity of the circumstances. They usually make their baskets underneath windows because they know the behavior of the flies and mosquitoes, which is to leave the darkness of the room and travel towards the light. But in their path, they cannot distinguish between the glass window and open space. This leads the flies to fly directly into the glass window and fall by themselves into the trap of the spiders. This hunting strategy was invented by the spiders after the appearance of human civilization and after the humans moved into houses composed of walls and glass windows. Recently, I witnessed a very wise spider when I made a room in my garden and hung a lamp to its ceiling. The lamp didn't function because the room was not yet connected to electricity. Two days later, I connected the lamp to the electrical cable. But during those days that I had not yet connected the cable, the spider had made a very large circular shaped trap in the air, where the center of the trap was directly below the hanging lamp. The diameter of the circular structure of the web was about 1 meter. It was free, clean, and fresh. During the second night, when I connected the cable and I switched on the lamp, I suddenly witnessed the flies that were attracted to the light of the lamp fall down into the net of the hunter. The next day, they were all devoured by the spider. I wondered how the spider related in its mind the natural attraction of the flies to the light, from one hand, to the hanging lamp, which was not yet connected to the electricity, from other hand. The spider had made its trap during the day, when the lamp was not functioning, while there were no insects or flies in that place. But nevertheless, the spider did its job as if it was certain that the moment will arrive when the lamp would be switched on, and then the insects will be attracted to the light during darkness of the night. The spider did its business with almost the ability to anticipate the coming events. The spider counted in its calculation not only the natural behavior of the flies, but also the artificial light of the lamp. But how did it know the function of a new element in a new room? How did it know the hanging lamp would bring light during the night into the room? qualities have nothing to do either with the intelligence or with the instinct and the instinctive faculty of perception. The spider's instinct is too limited to explain its capacity to evolve its hunting strategy in such a way. It must be related to something else. It must be related to the particularity of the spider's extended mind to observe the events before they happen. In some way, it must see beyond current time. The spider doesn't have any developed brain, and it is not bothered by the function of the cortex. This is really amazing. The mind of the spider is connected to a non-material field of knowledge. This field inspires and guides the spider to create the new successful strategies. An important capacity of the spider recently discovered is to place itself in a voluntary coma when it is captured inside of a closed space without enough air for respiration. After a while, when the air is released back into the closed space, the spider restarts its vital activities again. It is what the yogis and the Sufis name the voluntary death, or dying by will, by decreasing the arterial pressure of blood and bringing the cerebral activities to a kind of hibernation. For the seekers of the path of the substantial evolution, the voluntary death is the way to access to the high field of wisdom. The sacred and holy books introduce two categories of creatures to be under guidance and inspiration of the non-material field of superior wisdom. First, the insects, such as the spiders, bees, ants. Second, the prophets and the mystics. Getting awareness of this extended mind is somehow related to the temporary or definite stop of the cerebral activities. During the near-death experience, man becomes aware of the extended mind and about his real self. The spiritual seekers who became aware of this extended consciousness tell us that knowing yourself is to know your own creator. They also say, die before dying in order to gain this knowledge. The school of the mysticism, Gnosticism, and Sufism carries the treasure of the heritage of the spiritual teachers to taught their pupils the method by which they can set aside obstacles posed by the brain and to create a quiet and empty inner peace in order to free the mind, so it can be extended beyond the time and space, thus be inspired by the universal consciousness. Thank you.